Get out of the car, now. I will not tell you again. The officer barked, his hand resting menacingly on his holster, his flashlight blinding her. Officer, I am complying, but I know my rights, the woman replied, her voice steady despite the aggressive intrusion. Your rights end exactly where my badge begins. He snarled, violently yanking the door open. He thought she was just another target. He thought he held all the power. But what Officer Brian Foster didn't know was that he had just assaulted the one woman who held his entire future in the palm of her hand. Minutes later, his badge wouldn't save him. The rain was coming down in sheets over Atlanta, Georgia, turning the neon lights of Piedmont Avenue into fractured, bleeding streaks of color across the wet asphalt. It was 1:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The city was mostly asleep, but for Officer Brian Foster of the Atlanta Police Department, the night was just beginning. Brian was a 12-year veteran of the force, a man who had long ago traded his ideals for a cynical, power-hungry worldview. To Brian, the badge wasn't a shield for the innocent. It was a hammer, and every civilian he didn't like was a nail. Cruising in his patrol vehicle, his eyes darted through the rain-slicked windshield, he was looking for something. Not a crime, exactly, but an excuse. His gaze locked onto a sleek, late-model Mercedes-Benz S-Class rolling smoothly past the intersection of 10th Street. The car was pristine, a stark contrast to the dreary weather. As it passed beneath a street lamp, Brian caught a glimpse of the driver. A black woman. In Brian's deeply prejudiced mind, the math was simple and flawed. A black woman alone in a $100,000 car at 1 in the morning meant something was wrong. She was either driving a stolen vehicle, involved in illicit activities, or simply driving in a neighborhood Brian felt she didn't belong in. He flipped the switch. The flashing blue and red lights erupted in the darkness, reflecting violently off the surrounding buildings. The siren wailed a short, aggressive burst. Inside the Mercedes, 38-year-old Keisha Brown sighed. It had been a grueling, 14-hour day. She was exhausted to her very bones, wearing a simple gray collegiate hoodie over her otherwise sharp, tailored clothing to stay warm on the drive home. She checked her speedometer exactly 35 miles per hour. Her tags were up to date. Her lights were on. She took a deep, calming breath, signaling and pulling over safely into a well-lit gas station parking lot. Brian threw his cruiser in park, leaving the high beams on to blind the driver. He unclipped the strap on his holster, a subtle but deliberate act of intimidation he used to assert dominance. He approached the driver's side window, the heavy rain soaking into his uniform, making him angrier. Keisha rolled down her window, keeping both hands firmly and visibly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? License, registration, and insurance. Now, Brian demanded, skipping any standard greeting. His tone was laced with a thick, venomous contempt. May I ask why I was pulled over, officer? Keisha asked calmly. Her voice was measured, lacking the fear Brian expected and demanded from the people he stopped. You were swerving. Looked like a DUI to me. I said license and registration. Brian leaned in, shining his high-powered tactical flashlight directly into her eyes, blinding her. I wasn't swerving, officer, Keisha said, squinting and turning her head slightly to avoid the blinding beam. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I am going to reach over and get them now. My license is in my purse on the passenger seat. Stop moving. Keep your hands where I can see them. Brian barked, escalating the situation out of thin air. He wanted compliance, but more than that, he wanted submission. I am trying to provide the documents you asked for, Keisha said, her voice remaining impossibly steady. She knew the law. She knew the protocols. She knew exactly what this officer was doing. It was a textbook escalation tactic. I told you to keep your hands on the wheel. Step out of the vehicle. Now, Brian roared, grabbing the handle of her door. Finding it locked, he slammed his heavy palm against the window. Open the door or I will smash this glass and drag you out. Knowing that sudden movements could be fatal in a situation with a hyper-aggressive, prejudiced cop, Keisha slowly unlocked the door. Before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt, Brian yanked the door open, reached across her body, unbuckled the belt himself, and grabbed a fistful of her gray hoodie. With a violent jerk, he hauled her out of the luxurious interior of the Mercedes and into the freezing rain. Keisha gasped as her shoulder wrenched painfully. Brian spun her around, slamming her chest and face against the wet, cold metal of her car. "Officer, this is an unlawful detainment." "You have no probable cause," Keisha stated, her cheek pressed against the hood. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't fighting. She was stating legal facts, which only infuriated Brian more. "Shut your mouth," Brian yelled, kicking her legs apart forcefully. He grabbed her wrists, wrenching them behind her back with excessive force. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit deeply into her skin. Click. Click. The ratchets tightened mercilessly. "You are under arrest for resisting an officer and suspected DUI, Brian spat, patting her down aggressively. "I haven't had a drop of alcohol, and I have not resisted," Keisha replied calmly. She noticed the small, blinking red light on the center of Brian's chest. "An Axon Body 3 camera. I hope your camera is recording, officer." Brian chuckled darkly, leaning into her ear. "My camera doesn't see anything I don't want it to see. You're going downtown, sweetheart. Let's see how much that attitude helps you in a holding cell." He shoved her toward the back of his cruiser, his hand clamped hard on the back of her neck. As he forced her into the hard plastic back seat of the police car, Keisha Brown made a silent vow. She didn't panic, she didn't cry. Instead, her mind began calculating, analyzing the specific statutes he was violating: excessive force, false arrest, violation of the Fourth Amendment. Officer Brian Foster had no idea he had just handcuffed a nightmare. The drive to the Atlanta Police Department's Zone 5 precinct was a blur of neon lights and uncomfortable silence, save for the rhythmic squeak of the cruiser's windshield wipers. Keisha sat in the back, her wrists throbbing in agony from the over-tightened cuffs. She shifted her weight, trying to relieve the pressure on her shoulder, which ached deeply from being ripped out of her vehicle. Through the metal grate separating the front and back seats, she watched Officer Foster. He was humming a low tune, entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just violently stripped a citizen of her civil liberties. To him, this was just another Tuesday. He was doing the paperwork in his head, figuring out exactly how to word his report to justify the physical assault. Subject was combative. Subject made furtive movements. Officer feared for his safety, the usual copy and paste lies that corrupted the justice system. The cruiser pulled into the underground sally port of the precinct. The heavy steel doors rolled down behind them, trapping them in the harsh, fluorescent-lit concrete bunker. Brian got out, opened the rear door, and yanked Keisha out by her handcuffed arms. She stumbled but caught her balance, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall. "Move," he commanded, shoving her toward the booking area. The Zone 5 precinct booking room smelled of stale sweat, cheap floor wax, and misery. A few other officers were milling about, drinking terrible coffee and laughing at a joke someone had just told. When Brian walked in with Keisha, the room quieted slightly. "What you got there, Foster?" asked Officer Miller, a younger cop leaning against the booking desk. "Combative DUI. Refused to provide ID, resisted lawful orders." The usual entitlement, Brian lied effortlessly. He pushed Keisha toward the processing bench. "Sit." Keisha sat down on the cold metal bench, her posture perfectly straight despite her bindings. The booking sergeant, an older, weary-looking man named Davis, glanced at her, then back to Brian. "She doesn't look like a DUI, Foster. Did you breathalyze her?" Sergeant Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. "She refused. Said she knew her rights," Brian scoffed, leaning on the high counter. "I'm writing her up for resisting arrest, failure to comply, and assault on a police officer. She tried to shove me when I asked her to step out." Keisha's eyes narrowed slightly, but her face remained a mask of stoic calm. The brazen nature of his lies was breathtaking. "Sergeant," Keisha spoke up, her voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. "I request that you note the time of my arrival, and I am formally requesting a blood alcohol test right now to prove I am entirely sober. Furthermore, I request to make my phone call." Brian laughed aloud. Listen to her. Thinks she's on an episode of Law and Order. Sergeant Davis, however, didn't laugh. He had been around a long time, and he knew the difference between a drunk, belligerent suspect and someone who was entirely lucid. The woman sitting on the bench was articulate, sober, and terrifyingly calm. Take the cuffs off her, Foster, so we can process her. We'll do the breathalyzer right now. Brian scowled, clearly annoyed that the sergeant wasn't just blindly following his lead. He walked over, grabbed Keisha's arms roughly, and unlocked the cuffs. Keisha brought her arms forward, wincing slightly as the blood rushed back into her hands. Deep red indentations circled her wrists. Sergeant Davis administered the breathalyzer. Keisha blew into the tube. Seconds later, the machine beeped. 0.0, Davis read aloud. He looked up at Brian. She's stone sober, Foster. Brian shrugged indifferently. So she's just crazy, then. Still resisted. Still refused to comply. I'm processing the charges. You get one phone call, ma'am, Davis said, pushing a landline phone toward her across the desk. Local calls only. Thank you, Sergeant, Keisha said politely. She didn't call a defense attorney. She didn't call a bail bondsman. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before it was answered. Hello? A sleepy, professional voice answered on the other end. Marcus, it's Keisha, she said softly. Keisha? It's 2:30 the morning. Is everything all right? Marcus asked, his tone instantly shifting to high alert. No, it's not. I'm currently at the Zone 5 precinct. I've been arrested by an officer, Brian Foster. He is processing me on charges of resisting arrest and failure to comply. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Are you serious? Did he hurt you? I have some bruising, but I will survive. Listen to me carefully, Marcus. I need you to pull the roster for tomorrow morning's docket. I need you to make a few calls. Do not contact the precinct directly. Do not try to get me bailed out tonight. Let them process me. I want everything strictly by the book. Keisha, you can't spend the night in a holding cell. Marcus protested. I will be fine, Marcus. Just do exactly as I say. I will see you in the morning. She hung up the phone and pushed it back across the desk. Brian was watching her, an amused, arrogant smirk on his face. Who was that? Your high-priced lawyer. Brian mocked. Tell him to bring his checkbook. These charges carry mandatory minimums. No, Officer Foster, Keisha replied, looking him dead in the eyes. The sheer intensity of her gaze made Brian instinctively take a half step back. That was my clerk. Brian frowned, not understanding the implication. He grabbed her by the arm again, marching her toward the holding cells in the back. The heavy iron bars slammed shut behind her, echoing with a chilling finality. As Keisha sat on the thin, uncomfortable mattress in the cold cell, surrounded by the desperate sounds of the precinct night, she didn't sleep. She spent the remaining hours of the night meticulously organizing the case in her mind. Not her defense but her prosecution. The morning sun broke through the Atlanta skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the city. It was 7 a.m. Officer Brian Foster was standing in front of the bathroom mirror in his apartment, meticulously adjusting his uniform. Today wasn't a patrol day, it was a court day. He wore his class, a uniform, complete with his polished silver badge, commendation ribbons, and a dark blue tie perfectly knotted at his collar. He splashed some cold water on his face and smiled at his reflection. He felt invincible. Last night's arrest was already an afterthought, a minor blip on his radar. He had dropped the woman off at the county jail for holding, filed his heavily fabricated report, and gone home to sleep like a baby. To him, Keisha Brown was a nobody. A statistic. Another civilian who forgot her place and needed to be reminded of who ruled the streets. Today, Brian had bigger fish to fry. He was the star witness in a high-profile gang racketeering case scheduled at the Fulton County Courthouse. The district attorney's office was relying heavily on his testimony regarding a raid he had conducted months prior. He loved days like this. He loved taking the stand, the center of attention, the hero of the hour, with the jury hanging on to his every word. He grabbed his keys, kissed his reflection playfully, and headed out the door. The drive to downtown Atlanta was smooth. He pulled into the secured law enforcement parking garage at the courthouse, flashing his badge at the attendant with a smug nod. As he walked through the heavy, revolving glass doors of the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted. The building was a beehive of legal activity, lawyers in sharp suits rushing down the marble corridors, defendants looking terrified, bailiffs shouting directions. Brian strolled through the metal detectors, bypassing the long civilian line with the privilege of his badge. He made his way up to the fourth floor, courtroom 4B. Outside the heavy oak double doors, he spotted Assistant District Attorney Mark Henderson, frantically flipping through a thick manila file. Mark looked up, visibly relieved when he saw Brian approaching. "Foster, thank God," Mark said, adjusting his glasses. "The defense attorney is going to come at you hard regarding the chain of custody on the narcotics. We need your testimony to be bulletproof today." "Relax, Mark," Brian chuckled, patting the ADA on the shoulder patronizingly. "I've been doing this for 12 years. I know how to handle a defense attorney. I'll chew him up and spit him out before the lunch recess." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "I hope so. By the way, we have a new judge presiding today. Judge Miller had a medical emergency last night, so they swapped the docket over to a newly appointed judge. She's supposed to be an absolute stickler for the rules. Zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, and she notoriously scrutinizes police procedure." Brian rolled his eyes. "Great. Another bleeding heart judge who thinks criminals are victims. Don't worry, Mark. She'll fall in line. They always do when I take the stand. Just stick to the facts, Brian. Don't editorialize," Mark pleaded. I got it," Brian brushed him off. He checked his watch. 8:55 a.m. "Let's get in there. I want a good seat." They pushed through the swinging oak doors into courtroom 4B. The gallery was already half full with press, law students, and family members of the defendants. The defense table was occupied by 3 highly paid lawyers huddled in deep conversation. Brian strutted down the center aisle, feeling the eyes of the room on him. He loved the uniform. He loved the fear and respect it commanded. He took his seat in the front row of the gallery, right behind the prosecution's table. He leaned back, stretching his legs, completely relaxed. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through sports scores, entirely unbothered by the gravity of the legal proceedings about to unfold. A few minutes passed. The side door near the bench opened, and the court bailiff, a massive, broad-shouldered man named Thompson, stepped out. He checked his clipboard, then looked out over the courtroom. "All rise." Bailiff Thompson's voice boomed like thunder, instantly silencing the chatter in the room. Everyone in the courtroom scrambled to their feet. Brian put his phone away and stood up slowly, fixing his tie, ready to put on a show. The Superior Court of Fulton County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Keisha Brown presiding. God save the state and this honorable court, the bailiff chanted the traditional opening, Keisha Brown. The name sounded vaguely familiar to Brian, but he couldn't quite place it. He had arrested so many people over the years, the names all blurred together. From the judge's chambers, the heavy wooden door swung open. A figure stepped out, clad in flowing black judicial robes. She walked with an air of absolute, undeniable authority. She ascended the 3 steps to the elevated bench, her movements precise and deliberate. She stood behind her heavy leather chair, looking out over the courtroom. Her gaze swept across the gallery, past the defense attorneys, past the ADA, and locked directly onto the front row. Directly onto Officer Brian Foster. Brian's breath caught in his throat. It felt as if all the oxygen had been instantly vacuumed out of the sprawling, cavernous courtroom. He blinked hard, once, twice, his mind desperately trying to reject the visual information his eyes were feeding his brain. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The woman standing behind the bench, cloaked in the ultimate symbol of legal authority, was the exact same woman he had violently dragged out of a Mercedes-Benz just 8 hours ago. The woman he had thrown against a hood in the freezing rain. The woman he had handcuffed, mocked, and thrown into a concrete holding cell in Zone 5. Judge Keisha Brown. She wasn't wearing a gray hoodie anymore. Her hair was immaculately styled, her posture radiating absolute power. But it was her eyes that terrified him. They were the exact same calm, piercing, analytical eyes that had stared him down in the precinct. There was no anger in them, no vindictiveness, only the cold, hard weight of impending justice. "Be seated," Judge Brown commanded. Her voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, carrying the undeniable weight of the law. The courtroom sat down as one. Brian's legs felt like lead. He collapsed into the wooden pew, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat instantly broke out across his forehead, turning his collar cold and clammy. His mind raced frantically. How? How is this happening? She didn't say anything. She didn't scream, "I'm a judge." She just let me do it. And then, the terrifying realization hit him, she let me do it so I would hang myself with my own rope. ADA Mark Henderson stood up, entirely oblivious to the psychological collapse happening to his star witness right behind him. "Good morning, Your Honor. The state is ready to proceed with the preliminary hearing in the matter of the state versus the Rolling 60s Syndicate." Judge Brown opened the thick leather binder on her desk. She didn't look at the ADA. She kept her eyes fixed on Brian Foster. The silence in the courtroom stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. Even the defense attorneys stopped whispering and looked up, sensing the bizarre tension radiating from the bench. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Brown said slowly, her voice echoing through the microphones. "Before we proceed with today's docket, the court has a pressing administrative matter that requires immediate attention." "Of course, Your Honor," Mark replied, confused. Judge Brown shifted her gaze to the bailiff. "Bailiff Thompson. Please secure the courtroom doors. No one enters or leaves until I give the order." "Yes, Your Honor," the massive bailiff replied, walking to the back of the room and locking the heavy double doors with a loud, ominous click. Panic began to claw at Brian's throat. He looked around the room, feeling like a rat in a trap. He thought about standing up and running, but his legs wouldn't obey. Last night, at approximately 1:15 a.m., a citizen of this county was subjected to an unlawful traffic stop on Piedmont Avenue. Judge Brown began, her voice ringing clear and authoritative. The courtroom was dead silent. This citizen was pulled from her vehicle without probable cause, physically assaulted, and unlawfully detained under fabricated charges of resisting arrest and assault. Mark Henderson frowned, looking around. "Your Honor, I am unaware of this case being on today's docket. Is this an emergency arraignment?" "It is not an arraignment, Counselor," Judge Brown said, finally tearing her eyes away from Brian to look at the ADA. "It is a matter of immediate judicial integrity, because the citizen in question was me." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. The press reporters in the back row suddenly shot upright, pens flying across notepads. Mark Henderson's jaw dropped, his face draining of color. He slowly turned around to look at Officer Brian Foster. Brian was gripping the wooden pew so hard his knuckles were white, he was visibly trembling. The arrogant swagger from 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by the naked, pathetic terror of a bully who had just met his match. Your Honor," Mark stammered, completely derailed. "Are you stating that an officer of the Atlanta Police Department assaulted you last night?" "I am," Judge Brown stated flatly. "And that officer is currently sitting in the front row of my courtroom, scheduled to testify as a star witness for the state." She raised her hand, pointing a single, steady finger directly at Brian. "Officer Brian Foster." Every head in the courtroom snapped to look at Brian. He felt 100 pairs of eyes burning into him. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a defense, an excuse, a lie, but his throat was bone dry. "Your Honor, I..." Brian croaked, his voice cracking. He stood up on shaky legs. "There's been a misunderstanding. It was dark. I thought..." "You thought what, Officer Foster?" Judge Brown interrupted, her voice slicing through his pathetic excuse like a scalpel. You thought you could violate the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure under Terry v. Ohio because you believed I was a civilian who couldn't fight back. You thought you could falsify a police report because your word holds more weight than a citizen's? I have body camera footage. Brian blurted out, a desperate, stupid gambit. He thought he could manipulate the narrative, claim she was aggressive. Judge Brown offered a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. I am so glad you brought that up, Officer Foster. Because as a sitting Superior Court judge, I have emergency authorization to request evidence directly from the APD's Axon cloud servers. And I did precisely that at 4 a.m. this morning from my holding cell. She looked to her right. Clerk, please play Exhibit A on the courtroom monitors. Large flat-screen monitors mounted on the walls of the courtroom flared to life. The high-definition footage from Brian's own chest camera began to play. The sound of the heavy rain filled the silent courtroom. The video showed the Mercedes pulling over perfectly. It showed Brian marching up to the car, his hand aggressively resting on his weapon. The audio was crystal clear. License, registration, and insurance. Now, the courtroom listened as Keisha Brown, calm and polite, attempted to comply. They watched in collective horror as Brian escalated the situation from 0 to 100 in seconds. They saw his hand reach through the window. They saw the violent jerk as he ripped a woman out of her car, slamming her against the hood. They heard the clinking of the handcuffs and his menacing whisper, "My camera doesn't see anything I don't want it to see." When the video ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute and deafening. The defense attorneys for the gang syndicate were practically salivating. The state's star witness had just been exposed, on his own camera, as a violent, corrupt liar. Their case was just one. Mark Henderson looked physically ill. He stepped away from the prosecution table, distancing himself from Brian as if the officer were radioactive. Your Honor, the state had absolutely no knowledge of this. I am appalled. I know you had no knowledge, Mr. Henderson, Judge Brown said softly. Which is why I did not recuse myself from the bench this morning. I needed to ensure that this officer did not take the stand and commit perjury in my courtroom, potentially sending defendants to prison based on the testimony of a compromised, corrupt witness. She picked up her wooden gavel, the symbol of her authority, and held it lightly in her hand. Officer Foster, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, you swore an oath to protect and serve the citizens of this city. Instead, you use your badge as a license to terrorize them. You operate under the delusion that the law does not apply to you. Today, you are going to learn a very hard lesson about the reality of justice. Brian's knees finally gave out. He slumped back onto the pew, burying his face in his hands. It was over. His career, his pension, his freedom, all of it evaporated in the span of 5 minutes. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom unlocked and swung open. 4 individuals in sharp suits walked in. They weren't regular police officers. The badges clipped to their belts identified them as investigators for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, Public Integrity Unit, accompanied by the APD's Internal Affairs Division. They walked swiftly down the center aisle, stopping right next to Brian's pew. Officer Brian Foster, the lead GBI agent said, his voice void of any camaraderie or sympathy, please stand up. Brian slowly stood, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and slack. You are under arrest for aggravated assault, false imprisonment, official misconduct, and filing a false police report, the agent stated clearly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. It was a mirror image of the night before, a perfect, brutal circle of karma. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the corrupt cop was forced to turn around. The agent grabbed Brian's wrists, the same wrists that had violently twisted Keisha's hours earlier, and pulled them behind his back. Click. Click. The ratchets tightened mercilessly over the cuffs of his pristine Class A uniform. The sound of the handcuffs locking echoed through the courtroom, a metallic finality to a career built on abuse. Brian Foster stood there, bound and disgraced, looking up at the bench. He looked like a deflated balloon, all his arrogant, menacing presence stripped away by the raw power of the truth. Judge Keisha Brown looked down at him. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. There was only the solemn, heavy burden of a judge who had to clean up the rot within the system she served. "Officer Foster," Judge Brown said, the microphones amplifying her steady voice. "You told me last night that my rights ended where your badge began. You were wrong. My rights and the rights of every citizen you have sworn to protect are the very foundation that gives your badge any meaning at all. When you violate those rights, your badge becomes nothing more than a piece of tin." Brian kept his eyes pinned to the floor, unable to meet her gaze. The shame was suffocating. The justice system only works when those who enforce the law are held to the highest standard of the law, she continued, her gaze sweeping the silent gallery. When those in power abuse that power, it fractures the trust of the community. It creates fear where there should be safety. I will not allow corruption to poison my courtroom, nor will I allow it to patrol our streets. She looked to the GBI agents. "Agents, remove this man from my courtroom. He is to be remanded to the Fulton County Jail, pending his arraignment. No bail will be set today, as he is an evident flight risk and a danger to the public trust." "Yes, Your Honor," the lead agent said. He gripped Brian by the bicep, hard. "Let's go, Foster." As they paraded him down the center aisle, the perp walk was agonizing. The press reporters snapped photos with their phones, the flashes blinding him just as his tactical flashlight had blinded Keisha the night before. The defense attorneys watched him with barely concealed glee, already planning the appeals for every case Brian had ever touched. When Brian reached the back doors, he paused for a fraction of a second and looked back over his shoulder. Judge Keisha Brown was still watching him, her face impassive. She raised her wooden gavel high into the air. Bang! The sound cracked like a gunshot, signaling the absolute end of Brian Foster's life as he knew it. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Brown said, turning her attention back to the pale, shaken district attorney. "Given the arrest of your primary witness, and the clear evidence of his willingness to fabricate evidence and commit perjury, how does the state wish to proceed with today's docket?" Mark Henderson swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the empty space where Brian had just been standing, then over to the smug defense team. He had no case, not anymore. If Foster was dirty here, everything he touched was tainted fruit of the poisonous tree. "Your Honor," Henderson said, his voice defeated. "The state moves to dismiss all charges against the defendants in the current matter, without prejudice, pending a full review of Officer Foster's case files." "Motion to dismiss is granted," Judge Brown ruled instantly. "The defendants are ordered released. This court will be taking a brief 15-minute recess before we resume the calendar." She stood up, her black robes billowing slightly as she turned. "Court is in recess." She walked off the bench and back into her chambers, the heavy wooden door closing softly behind her. Inside, away from the eyes of the public, Keisha finally let out a long, shuddering breath. She reached up and gently rubbed her sore shoulder where Brian had wrenched it the night before. The physical pain was still there, but the emotional weight had lifted. She had not only defended herself, she had removed a dangerous predator from the streets. The fallout was catastrophic for the Atlanta Police Department, but glorious for the justice system. The video of the courtroom incident, captured by courtroom security cameras and released to the public under the Freedom of Information Act, went viral within hours. It was a masterclass in accountability. By sunset that evening, the chief of police held a press conference on the steps of City Hall, formally terminating Brian Foster and launching a comprehensive internal affairs audit into the entire Zone 5 precinct. Dozens of Brian's past arrests were placed under immediate review. Several innocent people, previously convicted on his sole testimony, began the process of exoneration. Brian Foster spent his first night in the Fulton County Jail in solitary confinement, not for his protection, but because he was a pariah. The cold, concrete cell he sat in was exactly the same dimensions as the one he had thrown Keisha into just 24 hours earlier. As he sat on the thin mattress, staring at the concrete wall, the silence of the cell was deafening. He had traded his badge, his freedom, and his honor for a moment of fleeting, racist power, and he had lost everything. A week later, the grand jury indicted Brian Foster on all charges. He faced a maximum of 20 years in state prison. No police union stepped up to defend him. His lawyer advised him to take a plea deal, knowing that no jury in the country would side with him after watching the Axon footage and hearing the testimony of a sitting Superior Court judge. Judge Keisha Brown returned to her bench the very next day. She didn't give interviews to the media, she didn't write a book. She simply put on her black robe, picked up her gavel, and continued to do the work. But the atmosphere in her courtroom had fundamentally changed. Every police officer who took the stand in courtroom 4B knew exactly who they were dealing with. They knew they couldn't lie. They knew they couldn't exaggerate. They knew that the woman sitting behind the bench demanded absolute integrity, because she had looked into the face of corruption and dismantled it with nothing but the truth and the law. Keisha Brown had proven that justice isn't just an abstract concept written in heavy law books. Sometimes, justice is a woman in a gray hoodie, patiently waiting for the sun to rise, so she can put on a robe and drop the hammer. If this story of ultimate justice and hard karma gave you chills, you are not alone. There is nothing more satisfying than watching an abuser of power get absolutely dismantled by the very system they thought they could manipulate. Judge Keisha Brown is a true hero. She didn't fight back with her fists, she fought back with her brilliant mind and the full weight of the law, proving that nobody is above the Constitution. If you love this story of instant karma, please hit that like button right now. It helps push this video to more people who need to see it. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who loves a powerful story of justice served. And don't forget to subscribe to the